Welcome to the Rehearing Beethoven concert series at the Library of Congress. My name is Dr. Paul Allen Somerfield, and I'm a music specialist in the library's music division. I'd like to share our treasures related to Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 29, Opus 106, more commonly known as the Hammerklavier Sonata. Regarded as Beethoven's most technically challenging work for the keyboard, the Opus 106 Hammerklavier Sonata has dazzled and mystified performers and listeners alike since its completion in 1818. Beethoven labored over its composition for over a year. The work consumed his focus to an extent not seen since the completion of his 7th and 8th symphonies several years prior. Beethoven scholars point to the sonata as the spark for the composer's late style, during which Beethoven composed the Missa Solemnis, the Diabelli Variations, the Ninth Symphony, and the Opus 131 String Quartet. Indeed, the Hammerklavier Sonata marks the emergence of many hallmarks found in these later works: reimaginings of sonata form, a return to pre-classical traditions such as the fugue and modal harmonies, and a playful yet brusque humor. Despite the Hammerklavier's revered status in piano repertoire, manuscript sources for the work have remained elusive. The holograph manuscript sources, that is, sources in Beethoven's own hand, exist only in sketches. No complete manuscript is known to exist. And of those sketches, there are only a known 49 leaves that live in over a dozen institutions around the world. And of those 49 known leaves, most are for the final movement. Very little remains for the first and second movements, and 8 other leaves are known to contain material for the monumental third movement. And of these precious 49 leaves, 5 reside in our collections here. 4 of the leaves, purchased as one gathering in 1941 through the Gertrude Clark Whitall Foundation, contain material for the final movement's fugue. In 2018, the music division purchased a single front and back leaf with sketch material for the third movement. I'd like to focus first on our sketches for the third movement. You may be wondering why we have only smatterings of sketch leaves and not entire sketchbooks or other larger gatherings. In the years that followed Beethoven's death, collectors bought and butchered many of his sketchbooks and sold individual leaves for profit. Since then, scholars have invested considerable time intellectually reassembling those sketchbooks to give us clearer windows into Beethoven's compositional process. Paper types, watermarks, and ink have all been factors in determining what pages were originally grouped together. Yet, reuniting the sketches for the Opus 106 Hammerklavier Sonata has proved particularly difficult. Beethoven did not use his usual standard format sketchbooks. To compose the work, he did use 3 pocket sketchbooks, the largest of which has long been missing. But for much of his more extensive sketching, he relied on loose leaves and bifolia, that is, 2-joined leaves. The consequences of this unusually haphazard process are readily apparent in our sketch leaf for the Hammerklavier's third movement. The leaf shown here has been known to exist for many years, but its contents had been misidentified. Neither was the leaf included in Hans Schmidt's 1969 catalog of Beethoven sketches, nor in the seminal 1985 text, The Beethoven Sketchbooks. Prior to 1963, this leaf had been part of the Louis Koch collection in Frankfurt, Germany. It was sold at auction to a private collector in Switzerland and did not resurface until the music division acquired it through the antiquarian dealer J.J. Lebrano in 2018. Luckily, photocopies at the Austrian National Library in Vienna allowed scholars some access to its contents. While the leaf was in Koch's possession, the musicologist Georg Kinski identified the sketches as being related to a slow movement for a violin sonata. Kinski also saw similarities between this supposed violin sonata and the Benedictus of the Missa Solemnis, including the barred 12/8 time signature found on the sketch leaf. In his 1953 bibliography, Kinski transcribed the melody from the leaf's recto side and presumed it to be in F sharp minor. Yet, in 1991, musicologist Nicholas Marston proposed that, actually, in fact, this leaf contains significant thematic material for the Hammerklavier Sonata's third movement. A close inspection of the melody, as notated on the recto side of the sketch leaf, reveals that, although most of the material is in 12/8 meter and not the 6/8 meter in the movement's final version, the melodic connection to measures 10 through 12 in the finished work is undeniable. And the recto side contains 9 measures distributed across 3 systems devoted to this opening theme. The verso side contains about a dozen measures devoted to the theme introduced in measure 27 of the finished work, as well as to the elaborate figuration that permeates much of the movement. Taking into account the 12/8 meter in this draft versus the final 6/8, the sketches correspond to a section of more than 40 measures of music. Through a remarkable visual display of contrasting pitch registers on the piano, these sketches capture Beethoven in the midst of his compositional process. As we study the manuscript, numerous differences between it and the finished composition come to light. On the verso side, devoted to the recapitulation of the theme first introduced in measure 27, we see that at this stage, Beethoven had not yet fixed the recapitulation's tonal scheme. Here in the sketches, the melody, featuring a trill on high C sharp, begins in the tonic F sharp minor like its exposition counterpart, rather than the parallel D major as seen in measure 127 of the finished work. Further connecting these sketches to the Hammerklavier's third movement is Marston's discovery of a connective thread between our sketch leaf and the recto of a leaf held in St. Petersburg, Russia. Only a facsimile is available for study at present, but a harmonic progression at the bottom of the page is almost certainly continued on the recto of our leaf, just before the introduction of the F sharp minor melody I previously discussed. Because both leaves have 16 staves, they may have even formed a single bifolium, although this does require further study. One more fascinating scribble on this sketch leaf helps us transition to the music division sketches for the final movement. In the top left corner of the recto side, there is a short sketch in 6/8 meter accompanied by the admittedly messy inscription, Auch in 3/4 Takt mit 16 besser, which translates as, also in 3/4 meter with 16th notes is better. Although some scholars have suggested that this fragment is unrelated to the Hammerklavier Sonata, the fugal finale is indeed in 3/4 and consists largely of 16th notes. Moreover, perhaps this fragment marks a connection to the fugue's introductory section. Marked largo in the finished work, that introduction begins with rising octave Fs not unlike those seen in the sketches here. With this connection to the fourth movement, I'd like to now turn to our other gathering of sketch leaves. The finale to the Hammerklavier Sonata may begin with an introductory largo section, but thereafter, a fugue dominates as the creative driving force. The subject itself can be divided into 3 parts: a leap of a 10th followed by a trill to the tonic, a 7-note repeated scalar figure descending by a 3rd, and a tail 16th note passage filled with chromatic passing tones. After its introduction, the fugue subject moves through several contrasting sections that feature contrapuntal devices like rhythmic augmentation, inclusion of a counter subject, a stretto of the 10th leap and trill that takes full advantage of the pianoforte's range, and both retrograde and inverted versions. Our sketches illustrate Beethoven's manipulations of this subject. Well before he had completed the fugue, Beethoven experimented with further harmonic and melodic invention of both the leap trill and 16th note portions of the subject. The last subject entrance in the sketches shown here begins with a tritone leap. Beethoven spells it as a diminished fifth rather than an augmented fourth. He also places it within a different harmonic context. This version in the sketches does share similarity with a moment in the work's finished version. Here we see the figure leap a compound augmented fourth. But the parallel sixth version of the trill motive, seen at the beginning of this sketch leaf, did not find its way into the finished work. Dozens of similar experiments fill our sketch leaves for the fugue. We can find sketches of the fugue subject in retrograde, inversion, and retrograde inversion on the verso of Leaf 2. Similarly, here we see what appears to be an experiment with rhythmic displacement. The trill falls on the second beat, and the descending 16th notes that follow likewise begin on the second half of the last beat. And we do see a version of this experimentation in the finished work. In one final example, the sketches on the verso of Leaf 2 also contain repetitive statements of the fugue subject in inversion. Why would Beethoven have bothered to write out the subject exactly the same so many times, minus transposition downward by step? Why didn't he just write etc. or ditto? Perhaps he wrote down the subject in full each time because he was trying out the motive in different keys, just as if he were improvising at the keyboard. Robert Winter has commented on Beethoven's tendency in his early years to keep a desk near his keyboard to jot down any improvisations. But by 1818, Beethoven's deafness had progressed enough that he relied fully on his sketches to improvise and experiment. These seemingly redundant scribbles provide us glimpses of the strategies Beethoven used to continue composing. Now, thus far, I've focused on the notes jotted onto these sketch leaves, but I'd like to close with a brief example of how even the paper itself can tell us something about Beethoven, his world, and his ways of composing. Watermarks are identifying images or patterns embedded within the paper that appear as various shades of lightness or darkness when viewed by transmitted light. They can help us identify when the paper was made, from where Beethoven may have acquired it, and even where he may have been physically while composing on that paper. By holding a special light sheet underneath that paper, we can more easily see these watermarks. And here, we can see a faint half moon and letters that form G. Kiesling in the lower corners of our fourth movement sketch leaves. Now, I could devote an entire segment to the fascinating history of watermarks, but suffice to say, here we have traces that have helped scholars identify that Beethoven likely sketched this portion of the sonata in 1818. Beethoven may have completed the Hammerklavier Sonata in late 1818, but for decades, critics and musicians alike deemed the work both impenetrable and unplayable. In 1836, 9 years after Beethoven's death, Franz Liszt performed the work in the Parisian music venue Salle Erard. In his review of that performance, the composer Hector Berlioz wrote, "Liszt has explained the work in such a way that if the composer himself had returned from the grave, joy and pride would have swept over him. Not a note was left out, not one added. I followed the performance with the score. Not one alteration was made in the tempo that was not indicated in the text. It was the ideal performance of a work with the reputation of being unperformable." In the years since, Regard for the Opus 106 Hammerklavier Sonata has only continued to grow, inspiring new interpretations that illuminate untold depths. I hope you experience such depths this evening. Thank you, and enjoy the performance.